We are back with day 3 breakdown and analysis of the $1,000,000 game. And my lord, this one was a wild one. We had some stacks in play, especially Alan Keating stack. My God, look at the number of chips this guy has. It is incredible. Let's go ahead and jump into our hand review. But before we do, I want to let you guys know that tomorrow will be the last day to use code DON'TPUNT for $25 off Upswing's newest trainer, Lucid GTO. Lucid GTO. Yeah, let me be able to pronounce the name correctly. Lucid GTO. Stop on by. Upgrade your game by training against optimal strategies to know how to play correct poker. Okay. Let's go ahead and jump into the session. On most days, we'd probably analyze some smaller hands, but given the number of $1,000,000 hands, we're going to only do pots that were over $1,000,000, and maybe we won't even get all of them. But we're going to kick it off with our first gigantic hand here. Brandon Stevens pocket fours up against Texas Mike's Queen 9. I do want to say thank you, Texas Mike, by the way, who voted on Twitter to have me in the game. Don't think it works like that. But I do appreciate the vote of confidence there from Texas Mike with hashtag FreeDoug. Anyway, moving on to the hand here. We see the action kicks off. We got a $2,000 straddle in play. Steve calls on the button 10-7 suited. Brandon calls pocket fours. Texas Mike calls Queen 9. And now Tom Dwan decides to raise it up here in the straddle with Ace Queen. Definitely the standard play here. You're going to be way ahead of the hands that do call you. And he actually gets called in every place here. So doesn't knock anyone out, but does bump the price of the pot up with what is more or less the best hand. We take a flop. 9-4 deuce, 2 spades. Huge flop for Brandon, flopping middle set. Brandon currently stuck a bunch. Texas Mike currently up a bunch. Action checks to Steve on the button, who decides to take a little stab here into the pot. Obviously not going to get through, betting 28,000. Brandon with a set decides just to call versus Steve. And this is where the hand kind of goes off the rails a little bit here. Texas Mike with top pair facing a pretty big bet and a call. I really prefer call here from Texas Mike. I think raising is a little bit too thin. That said, you will occasionally raise some 9x hands, particularly in spots like this where lots of people's pre-flop ranges are weak. But I'd rather have Ace 9, King 9 than Queen 9, and I'd rather do that versus some smaller bet sizes. So with Queen 9, I would prefer to just mainly call here on the flop. Anyway, Mike does make it 135,000 to go. Everyone else gets out of the way. Back over to Brandon. Very interesting spot now for Brandon with a set. What do you really want to do here? It's kind of weird, right? Because you can't really re-raise small. What would he make it? 250, 300? It doesn't really make sense to go that small. It doesn't really give you much opportunity to bluff. So Brandon's options here are either flat and look to play turns and rivers, or to jam. Now, this is a spot where I think you kind of want to know your opponent. Versus some tighter players, I think that you might want to consider just calling. Just because I think that there aren't that many hands that people can raise call a jam with. If you're playing versus someone that is a tighter player, you're going to end up against, basically maybe 4 deuce suited or pocket twos. But there aren't many hands that can really call a jam because tighter players are not going to raise call off a 9. But if you think your opponent might put you on a flush draw, then you can jam here and you're going to basically have the entire pot locked up. So I think Brandon decides that he thinks that it's pretty likely Texas Mike would raise a 9 and would be at least somewhat likely to call a jam with it. And so he does decide just to jam here on the flop. Now to Mike here with Queen 9. I think you just have to let this one go. I know it's a tough spot. You raise for value and you get jammed on. Helps him a little bit that he doesn't have a spade, but he's going to have plenty of other hands that he could call with for value. Some better 9s, some maybe 9s that have hearts. He can have certainly set of 4s or deuces himself, or 4 deuce suited certainly in there too. And then also Brandon just risks a lot of money here to win a pot that's like a couple hundred K. He's risking 700 to do so you do not have to call all that often. So I get the thinking that he could have a flush draw in this situation, and you want to, obviously versus a flush draw, you're even just ahead. But if Brandon has a hand like King 10 of spades or something, you're not that thrilled, right? He's still just a flip here with your 9, and of course he can also just have you smoked. I think part of Mike's thinking is that if Brandon had a set, he would raise the flop, and if Brandon had nines, he'd raise pre. Both of which do kind of make some sense, but it's of course possible for people to be trapping, particularly when there are four players on the flop. So ultimately, Texas Mike does make the call, and with 1% equity, it's going to be difficult to get there, and he doesn't. And this really, I think, swung the day. Texas Mike goes from up 700 to about even, and Brandon goes from stuck 700 to about even, kind of turning the day back to neutral from where it had kicked off. Our next hand, we have a big one between Tom Dwan and Tomas. Tomas calling King Queen the small blind here. Keating looking down 76 off in the big blind raises to 15K. And now Tomas makes the call with King Queen, 34K in the pot. We're taking a flop. Definitely too loose of a raise here from Keating. And for Tomas, I probably would be raising my King Queen instead of just calling, but don't hate the idea of going call call. Anyway, huge flop here for Keating. Flops top two on 7-6-3 with two pair. Tomas checks. Now Keating continues out here with a bet on the flop, $20,000. I usually like smaller bets on the low boards like this that are connected with straight draws, but two-thirds pot could make some sense too. And then in Tomas's shoes with King Queen, I really think you should just fold versus this big flop bet. You know, maybe you could float a small one, but probably just let this go. But he does decide to call and take a turn. On the ace turn, this card, a lot of hands now that we're behind for Keating have gotten there. He can certainly have ace king, ace queen, ace jack type stuff that raises pre and bets the flop. So he's going to keep firing with two pair. I don't think there's too much to talk about there. Back over to Tomas once again. I think you just have to fold here. You have plenty of other hands to call with. You're basically just praying he's bluffing if you call, but he does decide to make the call. And the river is the deuce. So completes the rainbow here. Tomas checks once again, and now Keating has decided what to go for value. I think if you're in Keating's shoes, you're kind of hoping your opponent has an ace that check called the flop and called turn, and you're kind of maybe sizing around that kind of idea, that kind of hand. And he does go for a big, healthy bet here on the river, betting 235,000 an over bet, and then Tomas just jams over the top, a little over a min raise. This is one of those funny spots where when a player essentially min raise jams for the rest of it, you rarely see bluffs here because it just feels like how can this work? Your price is just so good. And to be fair, we saw this a couple of times today where players did this, and the person that bet thought, oh, I don't think I'm good, but I'm still going to call. Because the odds for them are just so good that it's attractive to call even if you think you might be behind. Now, in this exact spot, I think Keating recognizes he's playing with a recreational player who is pretty wild, and that makes his life considerably easier to call here with the two pair. And what hands really beat you? It's basically just ace x two pairs, right? A hand like ace six, ace three. Those are the hands that beat you, but those might even raise the turn. So you really only beat if your opponent trapped you with 5-4 or a set, and I think those are just really unlikely compared to all of the hands Tomas can have, including King Queen. So Keating, one of those spots where you know you're gonna call, but hard to imagine a bluff, but also you just have to call, and ends up making the right decision and calling off the remainder to win this massive pot here. Keating's day just getting rolling, the start of a good thing for him here in the $1 million game. The third hand we'll cover here is a gigantic one between two of the loosest, most aggressive players in the history of Hustler Casino Live, Alan Keating and Texas Mike. Texas Mike opens the cutoff to $5,000 with 6-5 offsuit. A little bit too loose here, pre from Texas Mike. Tomas calls the small blind jack 9, and now Keating squeezes with ace jack of hearts, making it $30,000 to go with this very strong pre-flop holding. Texas Mike does make the call. Again, a bit too loose here from Texas Mike, but we're looking to take it to the streets and play some poker. In position here. Taking a flop, and both players connect 10-6-4. Nut flush draw here for Keating, and middle pair for Texas Mike. I think on the flop here from Keating, I like betting, of course, but I do think it's important to sometimes check in spots like this. On a board like this, the preflop caller will have all of the sets, whereas the preflop raiser will have more of the overpairs. So You're not going to want to bet too big in this situation, and there's definitely going to be some spots you're going to want to be checking. So with Ace Jack of Hearts, I do prefer the bet, but I would do a healthy portion of checking as well. Keating decides to go ahead and bet the flop, 35,000 into 60 something. I'd probably go a little bit smaller than this, but this seems okay too. I think Texas Mike on the flop's got a pretty clear-cut call. He's got middle pair in position. Certainly a spot you want to see the turn, and he does make the call. Turn comes another heart here. So 7 of hearts, giving Texas Mike an open ender and Keating the stone nizzles. He will win this hand. The question is how much money can he extract? Keating checks. Here's a little tip for you guys at home. This is a good one. In general, this is in general. It's not always true. But in general, if you're out of position in a 3-bet pot as the pre-flop raiser and the turn completes the flush, you can check all your hands and you will not lose that much value. Now, that is not always true. There are going to be examples where that's not the case. But if you don't know how to play in these spots, you can take a little tip from me. Check everything and then check raise with some flushes and when you have hands like ace king or ace queen with a heart. And then if they call on the river, you can jam some of them and check fold some of them. And basically the idea is you're going to be pretty protected because you're going to be check raising value and bluffs. And then you can occasionally check call trap when you have really strong hands like the nut flush, especially with good kickers. Anyway, Keating decides to check the turn. I do like this play. And now for Texas Mike, I like checking the turn back in Texas Mike's shoes. I do think that this is a spot that's nice to bluff because a lot of players will bet this flop and look to check fold this turn. But I think in this exact spot, 6-5 just has too much equity. If you start bloating this pot, your straight's not going to be that good. And it's also nice to have a heart in your hand because you block some of the traps. So I think in this spot I would check 6-5 back. I can see some merit for betting, right? You deny some equity and you put a bunch of hands in tough spots. And then when you get there, you will still be able to extract for some overpairs. But I really do think that Mike needs to be checking this turn back. Anyway, he does bet 85,000 over to Keating. A pretty trivially easy call. You could once in a while raise, don't mind that too. It's usually better to raise on the turn when you have like ace-5 of hearts or ace-8 of hearts. The stronger your flush, usually the more you like to check call. And you might be thinking, well, why does it matter, right? Ace-king of hearts, ace-5 of hearts, they're both the nuts. Well, ace-king of hearts, you block more of the hands that can continue. So it's more likely they're bluffing when you have 2 high hearts. This hand, I could go either way. I'm totally fine with it. Keating also probably has an idea that Texas Mike is going to be pretty aggressive in betting himself. And when you play aggressive players, it's pretty good to trap them. Anyway, he check calls. River is not going to matter all too much, but it does. It's a 3, and now Texas Mike has a straight. So he has river at a value bet. He's only behind if his opponent has a flush, or I guess maybe a 9-8 type hand that check call turn. So the question is what to value bet, and you definitely have to bet here in Texas Mike's shoes. I like 2/3 pot in this spot. I don't mind using some overbets here. If you overbet, it should be all in, and your all in should be some strong flushes and bluffs that have a high heart. And then your smaller size, your 200K size here should be straights, sets, and then a few flushes as traps and some bluffs too. Maybe some bluffs that are a little less good removal, like maybe something like Jack 9 of clubs or something like that would be a smaller size bluff. So that's how I would play this. I think this hand does not like to start going really big because then when your opponent continues, they tend to just have hands that beat you. I think you want to bet small and give yourself more opportunity to get called by a hand like queens or ace 10 or 7-6 or all those kinds of hands are more likely to call 200 and something K, and this hand does not play particularly well. Keating ends up check jamming this. He thinks it over for a little bit. I thought that was actually kind of a funny moment here because in his hand versus Tomas, he was talking about how, are you really suicide bluffing? No one suicide bluffs here. How could, the odds are so good. And so there was a bit of a tell there that he would not bluff here. You know what I'm saying? Because on the other hand, he's like, no one bluffs here. Why would you bluff here? It's so little more. And then he asked to do the same thing, which is kind of funny to me. There's actually like a tell there that I think could have saved Texas Mike a couple 100K here on the river. But regardless, Definitely a cooler river here for Mike. Tough spot all around, and this is a 2.2 million dollar pot. 2.2 million dollar pot here, or no, 1 point. How much was this pot? 1.8, $1.8 million pot. Yeah, 1.8. A big one, guys. The pots are getting larger. Just a pretty quick hand to talk about here for a moment with so many hands I could have gone through, but I just wanted to kind of focus on the Texas Mike story a little bit. Texas Mike calls pre-flop here with pocket tens in a triple straddled spot. Action folds to Steve in the double straddle, who raises ace jack. Definitely a reasonable play here from Steve. Want to try and get some value against what are likely very weak hands, trying to see flops. Then, when the action gets back to Texas Mike after Keating calls in the straddle with 8-6 offsuit, Texas Mike jams it, pocket tens. I like this play a lot, actually, to limp jam here. Someone's likely to raise behind you when you've got, especially when you've got Keating or Tomas. This traps them. Of course, opening is still fine as well, but this play worked out pretty good for him. Now to Steve with ace jack. It's a tough spot now for Steve. You know, effectively it's like 45 big blinds. Ace queen, ace jack's very close with that. Ace queen, I think you'd call pretty confidently. Ace 10, you could probably fold. You're right around that cusp point. Don't mind either way. I do think, though, typically when your opponent is Texas Mike, you're going to get a little more action than normal, and ultimately he does make the call, and we're off to the races, and my lord, this was a brutal one. Our final seven-figure pot of the day. I try with the straddles, guys, but they just get so absurd it becomes really hard to know. I think this is restraddled to 8,000 is my understanding. And Keating opens it up to $20,000 here in the small blind with ace queen suited. You know a game is big, by the way, when your pre-flop raise is to 20,000. Anyway, Brandon calls with 6-4 of clubs in the big blind. And then Texas Mike looks down at pocket tens. When the blinds get this big, this hand is a monster. He goes ahead and makes it $100,000 to go. And Keating now with ace queen suited, he has two options. He can either play some post flop and call, or he can 4-bet and look to play for all of it. I don't mind the idea of just calling your position. I think certainly some of the time you'd want to do that. 4-bet call also not terrible. We're looking at like 110 blinds here or something. I do think call is probably preferred, but an occasional 4-bet call is fine. I think also there's a little bit of him knowing he's up against Texas Mike and there could be some shenanigans here, and he's likely to get a lot of action if he does 4-bet. He 4-bets, Texas Mike jams, Keating calls, and we have a $2.2 million pot, and it's just like 100 big blind all-in pre-flop. Probably one of the simplest hands we're going to get in the week, and it's for the most money. That is what happens when straddles get on board. And Texas Mike is looking to try and hold for $2.2 million. There were a bunch of other crazy hands here today that I could have gotten into. There was this double check raise from Keating when Brandon Stevens had aces that was just wild. Tomas definitely brought some incredible action to the game. There were a lot of hands I could go through, but I have to go wire my money out and go home. Well, I might make day 4 video before I go home. But I have stuff to do, guys. So it's a bit of a shorter review for me. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you guys again soon. Peace.